The sisters, when they, of course, realized this phenomenon of this statue was bleeding, and sisters had this unusual phenomenon happening in her hand, the sisters didn't want the blood from the statue, and this is a wooden statue, mind you, bleeding. They went and put a cloth on the ground to try and collect the blood. So they thought they didn't want it to touch the ground. So they put a cloth on their chapel floor, but the blood, as it dripped from the hand of Our Lady's wooden hand, it would disappear. It would disappear into thin air. Never was there any blood collected off the cloth on the floor. The sisters had to collect the blood from using a cotton ball and touching it to the statue's hand, and collected it. And they did that for every time the statue bled. And Bishop Ito sent this sample of blood to a local hospital, to a researcher or some doctor there, and he didn't tell him where the blood came from. So, would you please analyze this blood for me? And this pagan doctor, not knowing where it came from, gave him a report and said it was human blood. But it was human blood. That's the whole point, coming from a statue. And so Bishop Ito recorded that. And Sister Agnes, of course, shared in this at the same time. And Father Yasuda, who was the chaplain at the time, when Sister came, it was in 1973 was like the introduction of communion in the hand all over the world, was really a big push for that to be made acceptable in the church. And already, even though there was no permission given, I don't believe, for communion in the hand at that time, later on there would be this approval for it. But at the time it was being introduced, it was kind of a violation of the rules for communion. And in Japan, it was being introduced by the French influence. There was a lot of French influence in the church in Japan. And Bishop Ito was uncomfortable with communion in the hand, but yet he wasn't sure how to maybe deal with it at the moment. But when Sister Agnes couldn't receive communion in the hand because she couldn't open her hand, it was so painful, Father Yasuda was inspired to say, well, maybe I shouldn't be giving communion in the hand. Maybe that's something that God is trying to tell me, that I should not be giving communion in the hand. So he stopped giving communion in the hand. And he gave this kind of official understanding that that's why this phenomenon, that Our Lady's statue was bleeding from the right hand for all the priests who were giving communion in the hand, and our sister's left hand was bleeding because of all those who were receiving the communion in their hand. And that this was since that was the main point of the sisters, one of their main apostles was to make reparation for offenses committed against the Blessed Sacrament. Well, it would seem that, people talk about sacrilegious communions. Well, it can be that, of course, if you're not in the state of grace, that's a sacrilegious communion, but the manner in which you receive our Lord may be sacrilegious, may be irreverent, may not be as pleasing to God as it should be. And as we know, with communion in the hand, so many people receive our Lord and they are not even taking into consideration the fact that there's particles on the palm of their hand. The priest, when he touches the Blessed Sacrament, he purifies his fingers. But all these people who are if a priest is a good priest, he purifies his fingers after he's given communion. But all these lay people who receive communion on the palm of their hand go back to their pew and don't even probably consciously aware that they may have particles, and probably do have particles in their hand. And so I think it's a point that should be understood and appreciated, that Our Lady was trying to indicate to us already that she was not happy with this practice that was an abuse being introduced mainly in Europe and Belgium and France, and that was already spreading to Japan by 1973. That was probably one of the first, you might say, lessons, that came from the message of Our Lady at Akita, which is the importance of receiving communion on the tongue, especially the laity, because there are abuses, and it's not a reverent way to receive. Even if your hands are consecrated, they should still be purified. And that is interesting that back in the late 60s, when Paul VI was being pressed by the bishops in France and Belgium to let us have this abuse allowed of giving communion in the hand, when he petitioned all the bishops of the world about this, he said, "What do you bishops think about this request for allowing communion in the hand? And do you believe that it might lead to an irreverence of our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament?" And the majority, over 80% of the bishops around the world, said, "No, we don't want communion in the hand. And yes, we believe it would lead to a lack of reverence for our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament." And that's the very thing that happened. So that, I think, is so important, is that Our Lady was trying to show and to impress upon us that we need to get back to an understanding of our Lord's real presence, and that we should be making reparation to our Lord and not offending him by receiving him in ways that are not appropriate or reverent for the laity, especially, to receive him that way.